Hello, welcome to our webinar with the Society for Advancement of Consulting's Special Interest Group on Global Supply Chain and Manufacturing Experts. We are here today to talk about the short term and the long term, how they sometimes come in conflict with each other, and how do we best navigate this current scenario we're in throughout the world. So I'm joined today, I'm Lisa Anderson, president of LMA Consulting Group and actually co-executive director of the Society for Advancement of Consulting. I'm a expert in supply chain management and work with manufacturers to help them navigate these trying conditions we're in today. And I'm joined today by David Ogilvie, who is from Brisbane, Australia. He is also a supply chain and manufacturing expert, and he focuses in on ERP software and how do clients best utilize that ERP software to achieve performance success. Also joined by Diane Garcia, who is now from Phoenix, Arizona, and is also a supply chain manufacturing executive and works with both privately held and public companies throughout the world. And then last but not least, we're joined by Karen Wilson-Starks, who's from Colorado, and she is an expert in executive leadership development and works with, generally speaking, larger companies from throughout the world. And so we have just the right set of experts to talk with us today. Several of us also work in Europe, so we can bring in all aspects from Europe, the Pac Rim, and North and South America into our conversation here. So to get us kicked off, I think we'll turn it over to each of us to make a starting comment, short one, on either the short term, the long term, what do we see as far as challenges going on in today's environment, and then we'll take it from there. So let's see, let's kick it off with the Pac Rim. So David, what do you see going on in your neck of the woods from a short-term, long-term point of view, and are they in conflict?
Are they in conflict? That's a very interesting question. I think short-term, the key areas that are facing manufacturers at the moment are getting a settled supply chain environment. Obviously, over the last 18 months, we've had significant disruptions and massive cost blowouts. So getting that settled is a key challenge for a lot of my clients. Dealing with the current inflationary environments and the reaction that the reserve banks or around the world are taking against that is another short-term challenge. From a longer-term perspective, I think a couple of the big ones will be energy policy at a higher end and what the impact that's going to have on their businesses going forward. And I actually think demographics is going to have a big impact in the longer term.
Absolutely. And I love how you got us started with several topics and kept it short. So Diane, let's see from your neck of the woods, what do you see short-term, long-term, in the middle?
So I work with, like you mentioned, manufacturing and distribution companies in a global setting. And I would say, given the time of year we are in terms of short term, clients are busy working to support year-end goals. And then, of course, getting ready for budgets and what's coming in 2023. So short-term challenges have been material shortages and just, of course, what can you get to support your backlog and what you can get out the door in the next couple weeks here. And then inventory has been kind of a larger theme. Just how do you manage your inventory? Do you have the right inventory? Are you prepped for, like David mentioned, navigating these inflationary times, but also do you have enough to support this growing demand that we may be seeing in our backlog? So I think that's the short term. Long term, agree with David on overall landscape. I think mainly I'm thinking more about the long term demographics and talent that we will have to work with companies to continue to develop and retain. Those are probably the top of mind.
Well, very good. Well, and prior to transferring over to Karen, I will add to what David and Diane have added so far. So what I see out there is that clients have absolutely been struggling with supply chain disruptions and inflation. So there's, if you can find the materials and the product, let alone who knows what you'll have to pay for them, and their transportation and logistics costs. So there's a lot of challenges that they're coming up against, and they're also starting to panic short term about recessions and potential recessions, and what should they do, and how do they reduce costs and reduce inventory and all those items. On the other hand, I completely agree with David. There's, the energy policy conversations are going to have a vast impact on our ability to be successful from a manufacturing and a supply chain point of view, even if we're pursuing alternate energy and renewables as quickly as possible, and even innovating at paces faster than we can think of at this point in time. There's a vast need to continue to supply fossil fuels, because it goes into almost everything that we use. So I see that as a very tricky topic. And it also relates back to national security and concerns about what's going on in the world. The smart clients are absolutely looking at reshoring and nearshoring, and that leads us back to talent as well. So we could go on, but we won't. The talent topic does bring us to Karen. So Karen, what are you seeing in short term, long term, and we'll go from there.
I think I'll talk about it more from a 100,000-foot point of view. A lot of the clients that I work with, they really are publicly traded companies. And so they're always having the dialogue and the balance between short-term, long-term shareholder value versus what's best for the internal company, and so on and so forth. I think going forward, what's going to be important for leaders to think about and to remember is that they have to maintain a both short-term and long-term perspective is important. They have to figure out how to balance those. And I would suggest starting with a long-term perspective. Who are you? Where are you going? What are your values? What are you about? And then as you think about that, then being proactive about dialing in what's needed in the short term and what you need to do in the long term to get to some of those mileposts. I would also say what's going to be important are the partnerships that are established where people are on the same page, whether they be investors or if they be internal people, and keeping an eye on where you're going in the marketplace. What do customers need? What do they want? How do you want to add value and serve at this time? And then the broader landscape of what's going on out there in terms of big issues. One, you've already mentioned energy. What's going to happen with energy? What's happening with diversity? What are the expectations there? Sustainability kinds of matters. So I think all of these will influence how the decisions are made and what decisions are made. But if you keep the big picture in mind, dial back down to the little picture, I think you can balance these in a way that feels in integrity.
Yeah, that's completely agree. I've definitely seen the most successful companies out there looking at the and equation, if it's customer service and inventory, or short-term and long-term. So the tricky, I guess the period we're in here is going to make it, I think it's going to separate the winners from the losers that can do this and successfully, because I believe that the ones that don't are going to be fall by the wayside. So it'll be an interesting couple of years here to see who ends up on top and who's going to be successful in terms of our clients and companies throughout the world. So
you know what, Lisa,
curious times.
I'll say one thing about that, which I think is important. I think those companies that take a more proactive stance and really do some analysis internally, as opposed to just maintaining a reactive stance, are probably going to position themselves in the best way. And so I would say that that's an important mindset to bring to the table.
I think you're absolutely right. There's been a lot of conversation about resiliency and resilient supply chains, but to your point, as much as we want to all be resilient, I think we're going to have to be getting ahead of these, be the leader going forward if we want to be successful. So it's not going to be for the faint of heart. So it'll be interesting as to how we'll navigate all this. So let's see. One of the topics that we brought up Well, everyone's brought up energy to a degree, so let's go there. So what do you see happening in Australia when it comes to energy, David? Or, how do you see that relating to the future here in terms of short-term and long-term?
So we've just had a change of government here in Australia with the last election. And we've gone from a centre-right government to a centre-left government, and one that is more vocal about sustainability and meeting our global obligations under all of these treaties that we're a member of, and all of these sorts of things. So there has been an increase in momentum towards moving towards the renewable energy path. Having said that, I am personally concerned that we are charging down a particular road when we don't have all of the answers, and we don't have all of an idea about what this landscape is going to look like long term, particularly for my client base, the manufacturing space, because in many cases they are very high energy consumers. And so in this transition period that everybody's talking about, they're saying that renewable is going to be cheaper, but it's going to be more expensive during the transition period. Well, that is a significant impost on my clients in many ways. And I'm just not sure that that this is going to be well handled. I have a high level of suspicion and skepticism around the performance of politicians. And I just do not think that they are going to handle this properly, and we are going to be lumbered with significant cost imposts because of this. And then you add to that we've got this inflation environment at the moment. There's a lot of serious decisions that executives need to make coming up. Do they invest in long-term automation, for example? That automation by default tends to be energy intensive. Mm-hmm. So it's going to need more energy to drive the robots or the automation you put on your factory floor or in your warehouse. But that productivity is going to be one of the things that offsets the inflationary environment. So we've got a very complex jigsaw here that we're playing with.
Yeah, absolutely true. Karen, what do you see? Because I know that you mentioned energy as well.
Actually, I'm very much in agreement with a lot of what David just said about how challenging it is when you think about the transition period of time. And I think almost of like a relay race. Let's say you're in a relay race and you're having to pass off the baton to the next runner that's coming alongside you. Timing is really important about when you release that baton in terms of the race. And I think in the United States, one of the challenges that we have is that our government is really believing that we are able to automatically go into these more sustainable areas of energy when in fact we don't have the infrastructure in place. So just as an example, if you think about electric vehicles in the US, we have very few. The ones that are available are very expensive. So not everyone's going to be able to afford those. We don't have electric filling stations, if you will, for servicing those vehicles across the landscape. And yet there's a very accelerated phase out of fossil-based fuel solutions. And so I think that has to be thought about very carefully by the business leaders when you think about whatever the product is or the service that you're in. What is the landscape looking like? How soon will your industry be ready for new sources of energy? What will transition look like? How will you plan for that long-term future? And I think that the companies are going to have to think way beyond what the government is already thinking about now to come up with plans that are realistic and that make sense for what they're facing and what they're going to have to do and the cost associated with it. There are also unknowns, even with electric energy and some of the other things that are proposed. There are some downsides that we don't often talk about in terms of waste materials or other effects that need to be explored. So I think that probably companies will have to do their own research and bring in other scientists to help them consider what they really have to do.
I completely agree. I mean, we just held a annual meeting at the Society for Advancement of Consulting, and we had an expert panel, including the head of the ports of, in LA, Long Beach area, FedEx Logistics, the transportation commissioner, and various other experts, terminals operator. And the one thing that kept most of the panelists up at night was energy policy and our ability to have these two, the short term and the long term, meet up. For example, there are some regulations that the state of California has implemented that there is no chance of being able to meet those regulations on time. So that's like a really big problem of the short term and the long term definitely not meeting up. That does not mean that folks aren't investing significantly and making great progress when it comes to renewables, but there's just no hope for the two to meet in the middle. So there's unrealistic expectations. So I think you're absolutely right, Karen, that folks are gonna have to think beyond that situation. And I mean, if you even just think about it, like one of the panelists said, like or actually it was in another session, but the head of the region area here, the economic partnership, said that the technology is at the point for trucks now that if you charge them, first of all, there aren't charging stations, and powering those charging stations is not something we can even do. But if we could, they could only run, they would require 4 hours sitting. Can you imagine? I mean, truck drivers drive, they don't sit. So that's highly problematic, as just one example. So there's definitely a break with reality, especially when you consider too that the electric vehicles are not, if you look at the total planet, by no means are there enough. It's using more energy because the batteries that are produced in China, the coal driven factories in China, all of the transport costs or transport fumes, etc., emissions. If you add it all up, you have a very different situation. So, I think we're going to have to start looking at the big picture. Go ahead, David. Sorry.
That's a really interesting point you say, Liz, because we're talking a lot about nearshoring and reshoring as part of our strategies to help each of the countries deal with this manufacturing disruption, the supply chain disruption. But the more we go down this path, it just seems to me the more that we indebt ourselves to China, who politically are becoming a bully and certainly in the Pacific area, and we are potentially dancing with the dragon. And
for sure,
I don't know it's exactly what everybody else wants to do. The other point that I thought of while you were talking there is, what is the social consequence of this, and what is going to be the social reaction to this? Because there is a lot of talk, at least in this country, about mandating these EVs and the renewable sorts of things. Will the population accept these mandates and having their freedom of choice about whether they want to buy an EV or an internal combustion engine, for example? Is that going to be an acceptable thing for the population or the electorate at large to accept? I'm not sure it is.
Yeah, I'm not sure it is either. My plan would be to buy multiple cars before the rules come into play, so that I can last as long as I can. So how about you, Diane? Are you hearing about our clients experiencing concerns about energy and the cost of energy in your case?
Yeah. David called it a complicated jigsaw. I think I would hope what comes out of this is just like you mentioned, it's not just the transition into these more efficient fuels and energy sources, it's the entire total cost of everything moving around the planet. And maybe we should look at this very high level. Are we making steps for a purpose, but yet we're kind of going backwards in the overall cost of what this all means? So I would hope that with supply chain becoming a forefront topic, that this is an opportunity really for companies, governments, everyday consumers to really understand that things that are moving well around everywhere, very costly. And so, what does it really mean to transition to these battery and energy and solar panel needs here? It's not just, one cost alone. It adds up and it has added up over time. So I hope it just becomes more visible to everyday consumers.
Well, I think you bring up or you triggered something in my mind anyway, that also relates to short-term and long-term. And that is obviously we've had a tremendous rise in e-commerce over the last several years. With the pandemic, it's totally understandable. Everybody wants something to be delivered to their house. However, talk about a use of energy. We are now boxing individual toothbrushes in a box versus what we did when we went to the store to go get them.
Yeah.
And what is used to make a box, first of all, it's manufacturing. Second of all, like lots of energy. And that's before we deliver that box to one house instead of to a warehouse. So like and are we willing to give up our Amazon deliveries? I don't know, but it certainly seems like we have a short-term, long-term conflict there if we look at it from one of many perspectives.
I guess I'm lucky because I don't live in the US in some respects, because the Amazon effect has certainly been felt here, but we don't get the level of service you do over there.
Yeah, we've become way too accustomed. I think it's going to be quite the challenge to, we all say, yep, we'd like to be, we'd like to save the environment, but then we also order 10 packages that day to be delivered separately. So I don't know. What do we really want? So there's definitely some short-term, long-term, like you said, the cost of items leads us to want to use technology, which really should be, because we also have a talent shortage. And that does not appear to be getting any better anytime soon. If anything, getting worse.
The connection I was going to make there, of course, was to the demographics, right? Because we have this whole bubble of millennials and whatever other names there are out there. I keep forgetting what they are. Gen X's
Gen
and
Z,
Y's
I think.
and Z's and whatever. There's that bubble coming through, and the baby boomer bubble, which I'm a member of, obviously. The power of the market power of that is dwindling, but there's a new power coming through from a marketing and an economic perspective, but also from an experience and skills perspective. There's a whole generation of managers and executives who have never dealt with a major recession, particularly in this country, because it's been nearly 30 years since we had a major one. So there's all of these executives who have never understood what it's like to manage a business in turbulent times. They've grown up with relatively stable environments. And the question is, with the exodus that's happened in the baby boomers, they've retired early, got sick of it or whatever it was for COVID, and they've gone out on their own or whatever, that level of experience is not there. Now, if we've got these unprecedented challenges or jigsaws that we've got to solve, where is that expertise going to come from?
I think that's a very, very good question, because my clients are finding, and I'm finding because I'm helping them look for some of these folks, not from a recruiting standpoint, but to help them interview and bring new folks up to speed, is that unfortunately it is true that sometimes they can require multiple people to replace one person with vast experience if we don't have some sort of a transition plan. So it's highly concerning. Go ahead, Karen. I could see you want to say something.
Yes, I did want to say something about that, because I certainly am on the same wavelength as David, that this is huge. So if we're thinking about long-term perspective, I really believe that companies have to really dial into those environmental factors such as diversity or work-life balance that are important to the younger generations, because if these things are not addressed and we're not thinking about them, and if we keep thinking from, I'm an older baby boomer person too, from our perspective, we come from a strong work ethic kind of a mentality. And even if there's not work-life balance and all these things, we will usually just do the work and keep on going. I think the new workforces coming along have different expectations, they have different requirements and different needs. And even if we're practicing automation, a lot of the real work in organizations is still done by people, and particularly the strategic level thinking that's necessary to balance out short-term and long-term scenarios. So I believe that we have to go back to, again, like I said, what is the purpose of the company? What are the values of the company? What's your reason for being? The philosophy about who you are that then might attract, for example, both customers and also talent internally. So when I think about the talent internally, it's being able to paint that vision and case in such a way that people want to sign up for what the company stands for. And then the company has got to have conversations that are open with these stakeholders to craft together what the new marketplace looks like so that the people are committed to working in it at a high level. And I think in the past, companies have been accustomed to just saying, this is the workplace, take it or leave it. And with a talent shortage, that's probably not the way to go. You have to co-create it where people feel they're a part of it, and it's designed in a way that works for both the business success and the individual success.
Well,
Karen,
go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, I think that whole values conversation and organizations putting their values out into the marketplace is becoming more and more messy, particularly around social media and so forth.
Right.
There's a lot of examples out there where a company has taken a position on a social position that's happened in the world somewhere, and there has been massive backlashes to those particular organizations. So that whole values conversation is going to get very messy, I think.
I would also add that it's more than just stances that you take on social issues, but I mean the values your company runs by and lives by. What's important to you? Do we believe in collaboration? Do we believe in continuous learning? Do we believe in honesty and integrity? There's some things about how you operate your own business that you need to articulate and share, and find like-minded people.
Absolutely. And to some degree, I remember when I was vice president of operations and supply chain, we went through a merger turnaround. And one of the first things we did is come up with our value statement that with this turnaround CEO who ended up sticking around. And I have to say, it's more than just that, because living by that sounds very simple, but it is so not. And so it is very critical, though. So I think you're right. A lot of the basics are going to come back. And what I think about this panel and listening to us is that we have multiple generations on this panel, from baby boomers, Gen X, millennials. And so we have multiple perspectives here, and we're actually well suited to talk about this topic. So with that said, Diane, like, what do you think? Because you're coming more from the millennial generation and viewpoint. What do you see that, on this talent topic?
Yeah, two things came to mind. I agree. I think just to go back to what David initially mentioned, which is, what are we doing with the older experts who are leaving the workforce? If you're a company today and you're not pairing or implementing mentoring programs where new hires or developing talent on the management side are not pairing with those more experienced, then you're missing out, because as those employees move around or they decide they are going to retire and leave, that expertise goes along with them. So I would highly recommend that you are, everyone has value to offer, and the newer new hires that are coming into companies, they have lots of skills that can be utilized. They just need some direction. They need some help and some focus. So I think that there's information that could be shared and passed amongst everyone in the company. And then the other thing I just thought I would share from a practical perspective is that, like Karen mentioned, the work-life balance. It's very important, I think, to every generation. Millennials, Gen Z may just be more vocal, because I heard on one of the actual SAC panels that Lisa brought up a few weeks back, is that millennials believe they can bend time, and I would agree with that. You've lived in a world where technology is at your fingertips. You can be anywhere you'd like. you can fly around and be, in one state or country as quickly as you can hop on a flight. So it seems like things are just very bendable to us. But I would say that overall, companies that I've heard are trying to kind of bridge what they think a workforce should look like, and that evolution of what the work-life balance can offer. So I've heard companies that are doing, no meeting Wednesday to allow their employees to really do deep dive into their assignments and make sure that they're completing critical projects and milestones. They're also doing mandatory vacation. So each quarter they take time and making sure that their employees are actually taking time off and not becoming burnt out, because that's a big concern, especially when we're in this more digital world and being on Zoom calls and talking to each other via Zoom instead of face to face. So I think that it's work-life balance. Everybody wants it. It's not just one generation versus another, but I do think that it's shifting, and the way that we work with each other is drastically changing every week, really.
So Diane, on your point about the succession planning, I think not enough companies or executives are taking the opportunities that are there to actually instigate some of those succession planning sessions or capabilities, if you like. And an ERP implementation or restoration project, like I do a lot of, are ideal opportunities to pull these experienced people out, because the project needs the experienced people, gives them the opportunity to put number 2 or number 3 into the seat and allow them to get real-time experience in that role while they have got an experienced supervisor close at hand who is actually being, focused on the project. So you're really killing 2 birds with 1 stone in those situations. You're giving the project the best chance of success with the experienced person, but you're also giving the business the opportunity to build succession planning and capability across the cohort.
I'd like to say something about that as well, which I'll talk about it in terms of knowledge transfer and how it relates to the values that the company has. I have some manufacturing clients where they want to do knowledge transfer. They have seasoned people who understand very technical aspects of the business. They have younger people coming in who may not have that background in schooling. And because the older generation, in some cases, does not have a mindset of teamwork, does not have a mindset of a continuous learning, they're unwilling to share the knowledge and information with the younger generation, which is interesting because you wouldn't think that this would happen. So I think it's important for the executive leaders and leaders throughout to really talk about who are we, what do we stand for, what does that look like day to day, how do we work together, how do we share information, because without people understanding those values, they think it's okay to just sit there and then ultimately retire without passing the baton in a reasonable way. So knowledge transfer is not just that having the people in place or having the people with the knowledge, they have to be willing to transfer it.
Well, I think personally, I think that's true. I also think that it's a really tough time for leaders to manage through the volatility and to set all these groups up for success. Because as someone who helps to facilitate some of these pieces with clients, what I find is that a lot of times the more seasoned professionals are willing to transfer knowledge, but in the current environment, they're not sure if they're going to keep their job after that knowledge transfer, and they're a little bit worried about that. Or they're like, well, my goal is dependent on me doing these particular activities, and nowhere in my goal does it account for this knowledge transfer. So, kind of goes back to, have you set up your goals and your rewards and your performance systems to support that? Same thing on the younger side of things is that they might think, well, hell, I've got a better way because I grew up with technology, and I don't want to learn what this person's doing because they use an old school way of doing it. So we need to bring it into the new world here. So I'll just do that when they leave. So, you have to bridge this gap, which I think is a really tricky thing for leaders, because you have to have strong leaders who aren't, just going through the motions, there's a vast shortage of leaders is what I see.
Which gets back to Karen's point about the values of the business.
Yep.
Right? If the right values are there, well then, those fears shouldn't be as intense as they might be in other organizations.
Agreed. And that goes back to me saying like, oh, I thought it would be easy to live by, like we had, I don't know, like a learning environment, like we valued people's opinions. Some of the ones that you would think that you would, have, and they were, like people would hold you accountable, but it's like very, it's not always easy because you're not trying to go against them, but it's the scenario and the way it's seen. So it's like a tightrope to have to walk. So we have to help our leaders to like walk these tightropes. Luckily, I had great support of a OD and HR specialist who was, had a lot of cross-functional experience and grew up in the P&G model. So I was fortunate, but without her, I really don't know if I could have like navigated that, well, I'm sure I would have done something, but how successful I would have been, I don't know.
I think we're sort of skirting along the edges of something that I'll call trust in organizations, because whenever you're balancing out short-term and long-term perspectives, the decisions you make affect whether people trust you in the future or not. So sometimes the short-term decisions, whether it be a cut, slash, and burn, so now you're telling your workforce that they can be cut at any time, that you really don't care about them, and that the short-term focus on the bottom line for this minute is more important than thinking about sustainability long-term in the business. That's a message. And so the next time when you hit that crossroads, people may not be willing to transfer knowledge or do different things because trust has been impacted. So I think that leaders need to think about the decisions they're making for the long term and the short term, how they position this, how they explain it, what they say is important, what they live out that's important. Because if one's trust is violated, that's very difficult to rebuild. And then you'll have people operating opposite of what you say the company values are, because what they see lived is different from what you say.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. And I think we've just been through 2 years of many organizations or many professions where we had trust, health system, scientists, those sorts of things. This whole COVID thing has put a lot of questions around a lot of those professions. And I think the population at a broader space has lost trust in a lot of those environments. So if over time you don't trust those, then the question starts to go through your mind, well, who can I trust? What can I trust? What information can I trust?
Yeah.
And I think at a broader scale, that's narrowing down to the individuals in the businesses and the executives themselves. That's a really good point, Karen.
Completely agree. When I took over this role as a vice president of operations, I remember this, one of the plant managers, I don't remember exactly what happened, but basically left. And then I was doing round the clock meetings with the crews, and one of the employees said, like, what do you think? Why should we listen to you? Like this has happened multiple times already. And, like, who's to say you'll be here in the future? And like, why would we listen to you after all? And so, I basically just answered it like, honestly, like, well, you'll trust me over time. I live by what I say I'll do, but you'll have to experience it. And I have to say, it took like a year of doing these and for me doing what I said I would do. And then everyone came around and they were, like the best supporters that I had. But it wasn't like I could just tell them like, trust me and it'll be fine. Even that was before the pandemic. So, it's not like I said, this is not going to be for the faint of heart for the next several years. And I think it will determine the winners and losers. What I'm seeing is in the US anyway, the last time there was such an opportunity on the other side of things, you either have great opportunity or you're going to, go by the wayside, was during the Great Depression. Not that I'm suggesting the Great Depression happened. I hope not. During that period of time, there was more companies that went the competition and we're market leaders for decades to come than at any other time in our history. And that's because they invested when others didn't, and they, you know, put these same values in place and, you know, looked to the future, but it was not for the faint of heart. So I see that same type of period coming here with our short-term, long-term conflicts we've been talking about.
What we haven't talked about, of course, too, is the conflict of the war in between Russia and Ukraine and those sorts of things. You know, that's not going to be finished anytime soon, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would bring up that it relates to, you know, what we've been talking about as far as supply chain disruptions, inflation, and recession, because a lot, you know, actually, if without that region, none of us are going to have phones, because a lot of the materials to for our phones come from that region, and a lot of the advanced technology computer chips come from Taiwan, and we have a China-Taiwan issue going on here. So we would, you know, it's kind of tempting to live under a rock because there's so much concern out there, but I think that these smart leaders are going to look at reality, but confidently find a direction forward, evolving that direction as conditions change, is what I'm, you know, what I'm seeing.
Yeah. So Lisa, as you know, I run a regular business owner and CEO lunch, and we were talking about supply chain resiliency and thing. And one of the questions I posed to those CEOs was, if China does get aggressive, and Australia has committed, as the US has, to protect Taiwan. So if we go to war to China, what does your business look like?
Yeah.
Because I can tell you now, China will stop supplying if we go to war in a heartbeat.
Absolutely. They already have stopped supplying certain things, and they just aren't, you know, it's not being highlighted, because why would they want to highlight something to create a problem for themselves? But, you know, there's already things that are, I mean, there's shortages galore. And we're even, oh, yeah, I don't even want to get into it, but there's so many problems of IP theft and, I don't know, national security concerns, etc. So to your point, we have to be forward thinking and innovating, utilizing technology without becoming completely dependent on regions that are in conflict at the best case scenario, worst case scenario on purpose, or who knows what's in our future.
And doing full circle, that means then we need to get back to that nearshoring or reshoring.
That's exactly where I was going to go next. So Diane, do you have?
But the issue there, of course, is, right, we do that. Can we afford to do that with our energy prices? And that's going to feed more inflation. So what?
Yeah. So I guess my question is, can we afford not to? I mean, I think that it's a conundrum. It truly is a conundrum. Like, we were just at a medical products conference, and our medical products are highly dependent on China right now. That's like insane. So what are we going to do about this problem? And you can't only nearshore so much. Do these nearshoring places have the kind of talent that's needed? Can they scale like the US can scale? No.
Well, and I mean, we've got these shortages in each of our own countries, but that's actually a global problem at the moment.
It's a global problem.
So we are all competing for the same talent pools in many respects. Like, I mean, there's a lot of talk in this country about, oh, we just need to open up our immigration again, and our employment issues will be solved. Well, no, because, you know, Great Britain and Europe and the US and everybody's trying to get these immigrants in that are skilled, and, you know, that's only going to feed more inflation because they're going to want more money.
Right. It's true. I think fortunately and unfortunately, it may be circling back to talent again, and how we can best train up talent, encourage baby boomers back into the workforce. What can we do to make things attractive for everyone to be successful? But then we'll have to live by our commitments, because we can't just like get rid of them at the first sign of trouble if we expect for them to come back a couple months later when things change, right? So
it's back to our topic, right? How are these long-term influences impacting our short-term decisions?
Exactly. So Diane, are you seeing, I think you're seeing some clients that are reshoring or nearshoring production. Are you seeing clients starting to at least do more of that analysis?
Yeah, definitely the analysis and also the action. So
Okay, so you are seeing both.
reshoring is obviously related to product and customer demographics and where do they sell their products. But I would say coming into, like, if you're a US customer base or US manufacturing, you're probably nearshoring in places like Mexico, or like Lisa, you mentioned the conference that we just attended in the medical industry. There was an entire panel that related to Costa Rica, Dominican Republic. So, you have a lot of these South American regions or areas that companies are considering.
So what challenges has that brought forward for them then, Diane?
Well, I was just going to say, so there was a conversation, and I think it's like you mentioned, it's this workforce availability. It's also the extreme weather events that have been happening. So, do they have the infrastructure to recover? Because we know that these storms are going to hit certain areas like Puerto Rico, or maybe even to some extent everywhere. It's not really safe any longer, as you've seen with Florida pictures out of there. But it's really, how do you recover, and do you have these plans, and have you done enough research to know that your supply chains will continue and the supply continuity will occur despite all of these disruptions? So I think it's the same things we've been talking about here.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's also about, like, investing in the right places, not just throwing money at education for, like, I don't know, for renewables, for related to, or electric buses or something, which we're doing in the US. But, and there's nothing wrong with that, but does that actually do anything to help our kids move forward in their their knowledge of math and science, and how they're going to, hopefully be our future generation? So what are we going to do? Because the pandemic has put us backwards, and we need to not only be even, but we need to be, like, leapfrog forward if we plan to manage through this. So there's like some, like I said, it's not for the faint of heart, and I can see why baby boomers, even Gen X's, and who knows, even millennials are jumping ship and saying, well, you know what, I think I'm just going to enjoy what I put together, because it's understandable, because it's, dealing with this VUCA, as it's also sometimes called, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, is here for at least the next decade. I don't even know how much longer, but it's going to be a challenge.
I think one of the opportunities in all that we're talking about so far is really doubling down on this concept, which we've talked about before, which I'll call strategic partnerships. I think in the past, it's been challenging because, let's say, if we're looking at shareholders investing in companies, they may have some objectives that are at cross purposes to what the company's objectives are for long-term sustainability. And in the future, I think it's going to be important for companies to think about, how do we select partners? How do we describe what the partnership opportunity really is, what we're bringing to the table, what we expect them to bring, and the expectations even for cash out in different cases. And having that mix of short-term and long-term investors in the business who understand that even the short term has to be balanced by the long term, or there will be no long-term business. And in the past, sometimes short-term investors didn't care if the business survived or not. So you're getting people to sign up again on the vision of the business at a bigger level. And so back years ago, when a big major corporation would move into a blighted area of the US, let's say somewhere in New Jersey or something, and what they would do is they would invest in that community so they could live there, but their investment in the community raised up the standard for the local people, who often then were prepared to be able to work in the company. I think more of those kinds of partnerships where we're preparing people to really be of benefit later down the line, and you're being of benefit to them now. So I think that's an opportunity we aren't often talking about. How can we grow some of what we need in partnership, and having people really buy into the values and the vision of the company, whether they be suppliers, employees, customers, investors, all across the board.
Completely agree. One of my more successful clients, and they were bigger because they were one of the big aerospace companies, but they partnered with the community college and the technical colleges in their area, and actually had multiple classes going on, not just for APICS or the Association of Supply Chain Management, which is more the fundamentals of supply chain, which is also another group that supports these webinars, but also just technical skills. And so they invested significant amounts of money in that program, and that was part of what helped them feed their talent pool. That alone wasn't even enough. So it's going to be interesting, because also small versus large companies, there's conflict between being nimble and changing versus having the cash, which is another short-term, long-term piece here. Because to your point, if you can't get through the short terms in terms of cash, you will not get to the long term. So that's it's going to be interesting. But I do think there's vast opportunities for those that are willing to dive in and be successful here.
Cash is not the king. Cash is everything.
The other example that I want to bring up, because Lisa, you mentioned, the conference that we all were attending, the SAC conference, and the guests that we had from the ports, they've had to develop strategic partnerships that never existed before so that they could collaborate together and actually have a more profound impact. So if they're collaborating, I'm just simply saying there is that opportunity to collaborate with those with whom we have not collaborated with in the past.
Well, you bring up a really good point, because another piece that came up frequently during that conference, during this medical products conference, and in a few other groups that I've been participating in lately, is the importance of data. And one of the things that the ports talked about is the sharing of data, because it's really quite difficult, because you're talking about sharing data with competitors. And so that's not for the faint of heart again. But it's also something that's going to be necessary, because we have to find a way to provide visibility across our supply chain, and to collaborate and make sure we're getting strategic partners. So and
this is not a new supply chain challenge, right? Collaboration with suppliers and those sorts of things has been around for 20, 30, 40 years.
Right. Even the use of data, we may have more tools now, but a lot of these, actually, it's kind of interesting, but a lot of what we've been talking about is really what I would consider to be the good practices of running any business, but definitely a manufacturing or supply chain oriented one is, I mean, to some degree, it's actually quite simple, but it's hard to do.
That gets back to my mantra, as you know, because we've had this discussion many times on podcasts and things. But a lot of it comes back to making sure you've got your business 101 working. Everybody's looking for the next big thing, the new thing that's going to make the difference. Well, in many cases, if you can clean up your business 101, those new things aren't really needed.
Well,
new things will emerge out of practicing the business 101.
That's right. That's right. No, it's absolutely true. I mean, one of the other topics that Diane and I collaborate with clients on too is like sales and operations planning. It's really just a business 101 concept. Like, why not? Shouldn't we be aligning what we're producing to what we're selling? And
are you maintaining lead times in your system?
Right,
to
right.
reflect accurate reality. Well, yeah, hello. If they're inaccurate, how do you expect it to work properly?
Uncommon common sense.
With the SIOP, the sales inventory operations planning process, you are leveraging data, but everyone's floating in data, good or bad. And so really the challenge today is, and what we work with clients on, is to make sense of the data, make decisions, and make good decisions out of the data. So it's a big topic.
Everybody's looking for BI and machine learning. If you've got really dirty data, that's not going to help.
Yeah, you'll learn how to be scattered quickly.
You'll learn how to have the right stuff. Yeah.
Well, I had a question for Diane, because that occurred to me as we were talking about business 101. So Business 101 may not seem exciting, you could say, because we've been there, done that, like it's work, but it's really critical. So what do we do with millennials and Gen Zs that may not think it's terribly exciting, but it is what's needed to be
What a
successful?
great question.
You have any ideas?
That's a very good question, Lisa. Well, I mean, I think that in just a high level, I don't know, millennials are definitely collaborators, and the use of technology excites. I think when I talk to colleagues, especially those who I've kind of grown through the ranks with over time since I started at an aerospace company years ago, has just been when I'm talking about the excitement of a company, it's what are their tools and what is their investment in their departments look like. And so I think most of the time it's really people get excited, or millennials get excited about the newer equipment or newer tool sets. And so I think it's a great point. I think you can get carried away. To David's point, you can't have all these tools and none of it be great. So I think if you can somehow blend the basics with the technology, it's helpful to get students and college age and millennial leaders excited about kind of learning whatever may be required.
That's a really good idea. I mean, it's a good point, because we do need to find a way to, because we are coming back to leadership, talent, all the different, like it relates to everything from reshoring to the energy, use of energy, how we can like automate, or can you power your automation? Can you train your high skilled resources? What are we going to do with all these people who don't have that? Are we upskilling or reskilling folks? What are we going to do about all these challenges? So very interesting.
But again, that gets back to automation, for example. If you are automating a process that is flawed or is reliant on poor data, then you are just making those mistakes faster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, garbage in, garbage out. So it's amazing that our time has flown by here. So I was thinking we could close with one key point from each of us that we should leave our executives and our supply chain operations professionals and other business leaders with, as they are thinking about how can they be successful in the decades to come. So let's see. Karen, let's start with you this time.
I think what I would say to people is that the innovation that's necessary for the future is not something that can be done by one person or one area of discipline alone. It's going to require a lot of reaching across many different aisles. And what's important to keep in mind is, although there are wars across the world, there are enemies across the world, there are people who can share our vision, can share our purpose, share our values. And those are the people we need to reach out to establish partnerships, to develop something that neither one of us alone would be able to develop in order to move forward in the future that we are facing. And I would say, yes, there will be trade-offs. There will be things that you choose not to do. However, choose for sustainability long-term of the future and address the short-term aspects that are important to ensuring that future. So it is a both and not an either or.
That's excellent. Well, David, how about you?
Well, to Karen's point, in order to help foster that innovation, I think it's important that executives make sure they don't just look for confirmation bias. They should not be frightened of alternative views. In fact, I think they should be encouraging different views. And that may be across the generational gap. It may be across lots of area skills gap, those sorts of things. But don't be frightened to have those difficult conversations, because I can say my experience has been whenever those difficult conversations have been had and had in the right spirit, the best outcome falls out.
Very, very good. I like that. Well, Diane, what do you think?
Well, I think this has been a great panel. It's been great to talk to everybody. I actually had an idea, maybe on our next session or sometime down the road here, we have a session on the basics and kind of, you know, get our perspective on what do we believe, because I do think it's very critical to developing the leaders of tomorrow. It's developing the leaders of today, really, and to making sure that they can navigate all of these disruptions and these, you know, like we mentioned, all of these insane things that are happening to us every day and what's going to be coming up in the next couple of years. So maybe that's an idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And I would say that we need to be, I really like the idea of thinking about this as a and conversation. We really do need to be thinking about short-term cash flow. Doesn't mean that we have to like take the strategy of cutting our inventory to lose a customer. We need to make smart decisions and find there are always alternatives. Even I remember when during that turnaround period I was talking about, when I was became the vice president of operations for a company, we found very interesting and creative sources of financing before we found private equity backers to make it through, and we were highly successful in coming out of it. So you do have to deal with the realities of the short term, and that's just one of many, but you should be not mortgaging your long term to get through the short term, thinking that you're just going to like maybe sell off the company or something before the long term gets there. Because after all, if you are thinking that, your buyer will at least dramatically discount the company, so you won't be in good shape that way. So I guess I would just say be thinking about the short term and long term, and you have to be willing to take some risk. We will fail. I mean, the definition of innovation is that you are going to fail. I mean, Edison didn't, fail endless amounts of times before he built the light bulb on an accident here. So we need to be willing to let our employees fail, and we have to be willing to fail, which is not an easy thing to do. But if we don't, we won't find our answers and our path forward. So I guess I would leave you there to think about celebrating failure, which is quite the challenge when you're the one having to pay the bills, or you or you have an angry customer or whatnot. But you have to find a way to put guidelines in place so that you have hopefully not terrible consequences, but you are going to have consequences you don't like. So
forward in the long run.
That's right.
But you're going to learn from it.
That's right. So you can succeed in the long term, and you might fail in the short term. So I guess from that point of view, but you'll want somewhere in there, you're going to, if you allow for a little bit of failure within guidelines, you will succeed in the short term, and then that'll propel you into the long term. So with that said, be thinking about your short term and your long term and how you can put this all together. And, join us again next quarter, where we may be talking about the Business 101 and making that into a lively topic here for all generations. Or we will be back in touch with whatever is most relevant to keeping our clients successful in the months to come and the years to come, thinking both short term and long term. So thank you, and we will see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.